JT was up at the crack of dawn. He didn't want to be. God knows it was stupid for a retired man to be up with the sun, but he'd spent too many years in the military to shake the routine from his bones. 0600, soldier gets up. 0615, soldier does light calisthenics. 0630, Marine swims 50 laps, then showers. 0700, retired man pops open a beer in the middle of his living room and wonders what the hell he's doing still getting up at 0600. Now it was after 9 on the 14th of September. He'd survived another year, hungover, dehydrated, and sick of his own skin. No more tequila. He drank beer instead. He was drinking his third when Rosalita arrived for the annual post-binge cleanup. Born into a family of 11 children, Rosalita had used her survival instincts to become one of the finest whores in Nogales. JT had met her the first week he'd moved to Nogales, picking her up in the usual manner. Over the years, their relationship had somehow evolved to something neither of them dared to label. As a whore, Rosalita had absolutely no morals and no shame, but as a businesswoman, she had rock-solid ethics and the aggressiveness of a tiger. She was one of the few people JT respected, and one of even fewer people he trusted. Perhaps they'd become friends. She straddled his lap, wearing a red gauzy skirt and a thin white top tied beneath her generous breasts. JT cradled her hip with one hand. She didn't notice. Her attention was focused absolutely on his face. She'd spread an old green hand towel over his naked chest. Now she whipped the shaving cream in the small basin on the right and lathered it generously over his face. Rosalita believed a man should be shaved the old-fashioned way, with a straight razor and plenty of devilish intent. He had enough respect for her temper to hold perfectly still. He sat there, watching the world take on the warm, fuzzy hue he'd come to know in the last few years. And even then, he knew when she walked into the room. Her feet were bare and silent on the hardwood floor, but she broadcasted her arrival with her scent. He'd been 6 when his father had taught him to air-dry his clothes, wash with odorless soap, and rinse his mouth with peroxide so the deer wouldn't smell anything as he crept up behind. In those days, he'd accepted such teachings with reverent awe. His whipcord lean, ramrod straight, rattlesnake tough father was omnipotent in his eyes, the only man he knew who could bag a 6-point buck with a single shot. The colonel had had his talents. Rosalita sighted Angela hovering in the doorway. Her fingers instantly dug into his chin. "Hijo de puta," she spat out. JT gave her a small shrug and lifted the Corona bottle to his lathered lips. "Angela, Rosalita. Rosalita, Angela. Angela is a current guest at our high-flying retirement resort. As for Rosalita, what shall we call you? An international hostess and entertainer?" He glanced at Angela. "Every year on September 14th, Rosalita cleans me up. You might call it her frequent flyer program." Angela nodded, her gaze going from him to Rosalita to him with open discomfort. The tension in the room was unmistakable. "Nice to meet you," Angela said at last, her voice unfailingly polite. Rosalita froze, then began to smile, then began to laugh. She repeated the words back to JT in Spanish, then chuckled harder. "Nice to meet you" wasn't something other women generally said to whores. Only a good girl would feel compelled to say such a thing, and at this stage of her life, Rosalita knew she had nothing to fear from good girls. She picked up the razor, shoved JT's head back, and exposed his throat. She pressed the straight edge against his jawline and slowly rasped it down, her dark eyes gleaming. Angela sucked in her breath nervously. "She can't kill me yet," JT volunteered conversationally. "I'm one of the few men who can pay her what she's worth." 4 forceful strokes, and his neck was clean. Rosalita shoved his head to the side and turned her attention to his cheek. Angela finally entered the room. She wore an old white tank top and frayed khaki shorts that had probably fit her once. Now they hung on her frame. In daylight, her coarsely dyed, badly whacked hair looked even worse, as if she was wearing a bad wig. For no good reason, it annoyed him tremendously. "Your wrist," he barked, startling Rosalita and Angela both. My wrist. Oh, that. It's fine, just a bit bruised. I have some ice. We'll put that on it. No, it's not necessary. It's not even swollen. She moved along the side of the room, up on the balls of her feet, her back to the wall. As he watched, still searching for something to do that would make him feel better, she took a careful inventory of all the exits. Someone had at least told her a thing or two. Her gaze fastened on his iguana, a frown marring her brow. Real, he supplied. What? The iguana. That's Glug. He's alive. Oh. She looked at Glug for several seconds. The creature didn't move. Where's Freddie? She asked. I gave him the day off. Gave him the day off? Yep. So there's no one here? Rosalita probably doesn't like to be called no one. But she doesn't live here, does she? Nope. So only you'll be around today. She was clearly nervous. Her stance went from relaxed to prepared, legs apart, shoulders back, hips rotated for balance. Just as it had last night, it tugged at his brain. Abruptly, recognition came to him. Cop. She froze. Uh-huh. I noticed it yesterday. You stand like a cop. Feet wide, chest out for balance. Left leg slightly back to keep your holster out of reach. She looked cornered. He frowned, angling his head more so Rosalita could attend better to his cheek. You're not a cop, though. You can't even hold a gun. I'm not a cop, she muttered. So just who are you, Angela? And what about your daughter? What daughter? Her voice had gone falsetto. Oh, give it up. You can't lie worth a damn. She smiled tightly. Then you'll have to teach me how. Idiotas, Rosalita interjected. She grabbed the hand towel and rubbed the remains of the shaving cream from JT's face with more force than necessary. Hombres y mujeres? Bah, perritos y gatitas. With another shake of her head, she flattened her palm on JT's chest and tried to launch herself from his lap. He clamped one hand over Rosalita's wrist. Wait. He twisted her lush form on his lap, bringing her ample hips intimately against his groin. Angela had gone still, as if expecting some new form of attack. Look at her, he said, pointing at Angela. Look at that haircut, Rosalita. We can't have her running around like that. Rosalita raked Angela up and down with a scathing eye. She was clearly unimpressed. I can't take it anymore, Rosalita. With that due, she might as well pin a fugitive sign on her coat. Fix it for me, will you? We'll consider it my good deed for the decade. You're too kind, Angela murmured. JT continued focusing on Rosalita. I'll pay, of course. Payment was the magic word. Rosalita started out asking for 20, but settled for 10. JT took the money from a highly skeptical Angela, pointing out that Rosalita certainly couldn't do any worse than Angela had. Moments later, Rosalita had Angela positioned in JT's chair, the green towel wrapped around her neck. While she washed Angela's hair and set about snipping with expert flair, JT propped himself up on the edge of the couch and opened a fresh beer, despite Angela's disapproving frown. He could see her wrist, now on her lap. It was badly bruised. So now you're beating up on women, JT. Just how low do you plan on sinking? In the disconcerting quiet of his living room, he didn't have an answer. He'd never considered himself a great man, not even a good man. But he had his few principles, and they gave him comfort. Don't lie and don't pretend. Don't hurt people weaker than yourself. There are enough SOBs out there who deserve it. Never ever hurt a woman. If Rachel could see him now, she would be ashamed. He crossed over to the sliding glass door and watched the sunlight dance across the rippling surface of his pool. Termine, Rosalita announced. Reluctantly, JT turned to inspect Angela's new look. He froze, too stunned for words. Rosalita had hacked off most of Angela's hair. Now intricately layered strands darted before her ears, wisped at the back of her neck, and fringed around her eyes. The short-cropped hair should have made her look like a teenage boy, except teenage boys didn't have cheekbones that high, noses that small, or lips that full. Teenage boys didn't have saucer-shaped eyes of liquid brown, framed by thick, lush lashes. Jesus Christ, he murmured. Jesus H. Christ. He started pacing. Even then he felt the tension curling up inside his belly. It's a start. Angela sounded a little stunned by the transformation herself as she gazed into the hand mirror. Rosalita bustled away with the basin of soapy water, leaving them alone in the living room. A taut silence descended. Angela's fingers began to fidget on her lap. "Want a piece of advice?" JT said all of a sudden. "It's free." "Doesn't that make 2 good deeds in one day? I thought you'd already met your quota for the year." "You caught me at a weak moment. Now, do you want the advice or what?" "Okay." "Dye your hair," he said flatly. "It's the trick of a disguise. Come up with something that looks even more you than the real you. I'd recommend a dark brown or auburn, something that fits your natural coloring. Then you'll have a new look that's subtle. Right now you're too obvious." "Oh. So there you go. Visit a pharmacy, buy some hair dye, and 30 minutes later you'll be all set." "Thank you." He grimaced. Advice wasn't that good. "JT, about yesterday, I need to talk to you. Will you—" "Hungry?" He turned to face her. "You need to eat more. I can make oatmeal." She hesitated, clearly wanting to return to the original topic. "That makes 3 good deeds," she pointed out. "Blame it on my upbringing. I certainly do." "Breakfast would be nice, I guess." She nodded toward the nearly empty beer bottle dangling from his fingertips. "Looks like you've already had yours." "Yep." "Do you always drink so much?" "Only to excess." "Vince didn't say you were an alcoholic." "I am not an alcoholic. Prissy teetotaler." He thumped the bottle against his thigh. She had an accent, a northern accent, well-educated. What had brought a well-educated northern woman all the way to the Mexican border, exhausted, malnourished, and obviously terrified? His gaze fell to her thighs. Shit. He took a step toward her. She stiffened. It didn't matter. He walked right up to her, even as she leaned way back, sinking into the chair. Her eyes were wide and fearful. He ignored her distress, reaching out and swiping a finger down the vicious scar marring her pale thigh. Broad, shiny, many snaking tributaries, the kind that would be made by a bone snapping and tearing through flesh. "He do that?" She didn't answer. "Damn it, did he do that?" She opened her mouth, then gave up and simply stared at him. "Who the hell are you, Angela?" "A woman who needs help." "Your husband was that bad?" "No," she said bluntly. "He was worse." JT turned away. He was angry again. That was always his problem. He was too good at getting angry and not good enough at fixing anything. Control. It's not your problem. It's not your business. But he hated the sight of the scar on her thigh. It made him think of things he dedicated the last few years to forgetting, and it made him want to find her ex-husband and slam his fist through his face. He forced himself to relax and took a swallow from his beer. He didn't speak again until he trusted himself completely. "I'll make oatmeal." "Thank you." "Honey, you haven't tasted it yet." Angela followed him into the kitchen. He was proud of the kitchen. Rachel had designed it. He knew a lot about pools, and in the last couple of years he'd become a good landscaper. He didn't know much about decorating, though. In the Marines you stuck a girly poster above your bed, and that was considered the finishing touch. Rachel had had a natural flair, so she designed the house they were going to build in Montana, where the sky was endless, and they would always feel free. He was going to learn about horses. She was going to study interior decorating. Maybe they would have a second kid, give Teddy a little sister to play with, and Teddy and his little sister would be raised right, without any bad memories to keep them awake on dark nights later in life. Those dreams were gone. JT just had Rachel's kitchen, a large, cool room with red-tiled floor and eggshell blue counter. The stove was big and accented with a wreath of jalapenos. A huge collection of brass pots and pans hung from a wire rack suspended from the ceiling. He'd placed each one just where he figured Rachel would have, having listened to her excitedly describe the kitchen night after night as they'd lain together in bed and dreamed like children. "It's a nice kitchen," Angela said from behind him. Do you cook a lot? I don't cook at all. He moved to the sliding glass door, which Rosalita had left slightly cracked. The heat seeped in like a tentacled beast. He shut the door. You aren't going to lock it? Lock what? The door. No. There was a small pause. He contemplated the pots and pans, trying to figure out which to grab. It had been a long time since he'd tried cooking anything. That was Freddie's job. Do you lock your front door? Nope. Could I do it? He looked at her. She stood by the wood table, her hands twisting in front of her, and her gaze fastened on the sliding glass door. Sweetheart, this is Nogales, the outskirts of Nogales. You don't have to worry about anything here. Please. He was really starting to hate how well she used that word. You're scared, he said flatly. She didn't bother to deny it. You think he followed you here? This big bad ex-husband of yours? It's possible. He's very, very good at that. You said you paid cash, used fake names. Yes? Then you're fine. He turned back to the stove, but he heard her move behind him, then heard the click of the sliding glass door lock sliding home. Whatever. He didn't feel like telling her about the small arsenal he kept in a safe, and the fact that even dead drunk he could shoot the Lincoln head out of a penny at 200 yards. If she wanted the doors locked that badly, he wasn't going to argue. He boiled water. He opened a canister of oatmeal and wondered how much he was supposed to dump in. He dumped in half and figured, what the hell? If he could rig explosives, he ought to be able to manage oatmeal. Generally, people measure it out, Angela commented, returning to the kitchen. I like to live dangerously. I want my gun back. The water logged at 22? You'd be better off with a slingshot. I want my gun. It irritated him. Too many people thought guns fix things. They didn't. He ought to know. There wasn't anything he couldn't do with a rifle, and yet everyone he'd ever loved had been destroyed. Guns didn't fix anything. First, let's get through breakfast. He dumped the oatmeal into 2 bowls. It had the same consistency as mud. He sprinkled the bowls with raisins for more iron and poured 2 glasses of milk. Angela looked at the oatmeal as if it were an unrecognizable life form. Eat, he said. Tough guys never turn away from a nutritious meal. Hell, if we were outside, I would have topped it with bugs. They're almost pure protein, you know. I didn't know, she confessed, and finally, gingerly, scooped up the first spoonful and thrust it into her mouth. Her eyes were closed. She looked like a little kid, and he found himself thinking of Teddy again with a sharp, bittersweet pang. Yuck, she said. Told you I wasn't a good cook. He took in 3 spoonfuls at once. Don't chew, it goes down easier. She looked horrified. She pushed the bowl away. Just as fast, he pushed it back in front of her. Eat, he ordered. I wasn't kidding before. Soldiers eat what they're given. And you need your iron, Rambo, so stop dreaming about room service. For a moment it appeared that she would defy him, but then she picked up her spoon and eyed her oatmeal as if it were a summit to be scaled. I can do this. She dug in. It's oatmeal, Angela, not Armageddon. She ate the whole bowl and cleared the dishes without saying a word. Then she began washing them with the smooth movements of someone who'd done chores all her life. JT wasn't used to having someone else around who wasn't Freddie or Rosalita. He felt uncomfortable and, worse, self-conscious. Virginia etiquette crept up and tapped him on the shoulder. He should put a shirt on. He should put on shoes. He should pull out a chair for the nice young lady, offer her lemonade, comment on her beauty, and talk about the weather. Why move to Arizona? Angela asked. She stacked the rinsed dishes noisily beside the sink. Her bruised wrist didn't seem to bother her. No helmet laws. Oh. She'd run out of things to say. He'd run out of them a long time ago himself. He began ticking off the seconds in his mind. He'd hit only 6 when she shut off the water and pinned him with a determined look. I'm not going to leave, she announced. I need your help. Sooner or later, you'll realize that. I'm not going to realize any such thing. You're lying to me through your teeth. Her lips thinned. You don't want the truth. I know men like you. You don't want to become involved. You think you're happy living in a self-pitying vacuum. Self-pity? That's what's wrong with me? First it's drinking, now self-pity. You watch a lot of Oprah? You think you'll be better off if you never care again. Can you prove otherwise? I don't need you to care, Mr. Dillon. I don't need you to give a rat's ass about me. I want you to train me anyway. You want me to be a lapdog, he corrected her. You want me to listen to your lies, do as you ask, and never question a thing. I know how it works. I've seen Oprah too. He kicked back his chair and crossed the alcove. He passed the barrier of the counter. He kept advancing, his eyes dark slits. He saw her mouth open, but no word of protest emerged. She took a step back, but was brought up short by the kitchen sink. She was trapped. He flattened her against the counter. Her breath came out more rapidly, but she didn't back down. She brought her chin up defiantly and met his gaze. He leaned into her, flattening her breasts against his bare torso, pressing his body against hers so she'd know exactly what he was capable of. He lowered his head until his breath whispered across her cheek, and she sucked in her breath in an attempt to put distance between them. I don't believe you, he said softly, dangerously. I don't believe a woman abandons her daughter and comes halfway across the country to a mercenary's house just because her ex-husband is stalking her. And I don't like being lied to and used. He planted his hands on the countertop. Why shouldn't a woman hire a trained professional? She licked her lips nervously, then caught herself and stated more fiercely, husbands, boyfriends, fathers kill women all the time. Hire a bodyguard. I don't want a bodyguard. I want to know how to fight. I want to know how to protect my daughter. I'm so sick and tired of running scared. You, her finger jabbed his chest. You probably don't know anything about being vulnerable, being frightened. But I know, and I'm sick of it. I want my life back. She grabbed one of the porcelain bowls and shattered it against the sink. She raised one jagged shard and wielded it like a knife. I might have been slow once. I might have actually thought that if I was just good enough, just obedient enough, just sweet enough, it would keep me safe. Well, I don't do sweet anymore, and I don't do obedient anymore, so don't mess with me, Mr. Dillon. You have no idea what I'm capable of. She pressed the sharp edge against his bare chest with enough force to line his skin. The edge ran against the scar that zigzagged furiously down his sternum. That scar had been inflicted by a man known for his sharp temper, fast hands, and utter lack of remorse. J.T. explored Angela's eyes now to see if she had that in her. He wouldn't grant her speed, he wouldn't grant her skill, but in her gaze he found something better. Dispassion. Jesus, you are a dangerous woman. I'm learning. A sound split the air, startling them both. High, shrill sirens, wailing sirens approaching his house. He took a step back. His first thought was Marion, but then he noticed his house guest. She'd frozen, and she appeared terrified. Why would the cops frighten a woman running from her husband? Then he knew, positively knew, that he'd been used. What have you done? Nothing, absolutely nothing, she muttered. The sirens wailed closer. 3 cars, he figured. 3 police cars pulling into his driveway and shattering his peace. Why are you so afraid? What are you hiding? Her eyes were no longer so certain. She tried to push away, but his grip was too strong. Let me go. I didn't do anything. I just don't want anyone to know I'm here, especially not the cops. That shy, Angela? It's not safe. He has contacts. He. Sure, Angela, this omnipotent he, the mystery man who may or may not be stalking you, who may or may not have injured your leg, who may or may not even exist. I'm tired of he, Angela. You want my help, you better do a hell of a lot better than that. I'm not lying. Jim wants me dead. No, he wants me to suffer horribly. I saw the pictures. I saw what he did. Her voice trailed off. Then she went wild, beating at him furiously. She tried to jab his shoulder with the porcelain shard, but he deflected the blow, knocking the makeshift weapon from her hand. Let me go, she cried. The sirens came to a screeching halt on his driveway. Oh, my God, she whispered. Maybe he's already found me. His hands gripped her shoulders, but suddenly he wasn't so sure. Her fear was too genuine, her panic too real. He could feel the tremors beginning now, snaking down her delicate frame. Talk to me, Angela. Tell me the truth. Come on. He was a cop, don't you get it? He was a cop. He stepped back in shock, automatically letting her go. He was surprised, but didn't know why he should be. There was no rule saying cops had to be good guys, just as there was no guarantee that well-respected Army colonels didn't torture their families as a hobby. Angela moved into the middle of the kitchen. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her thin waist. I need my gun back. Give me my gun. I can't do that. Oh, what are you so afraid of? Do you think I'm going to try to shoot my way out with a pea shooter? A gun won't help you. It's the only thing that has. She paced a dizzying circle. I'm leaving. Tell them what you want. I won't let them see me here. I thought confidentiality meant something in your line of work. Wait. I don't have time. She kept moving. They both heard the first of several car doors open and then slam shut. Angela didn't turn around. Seconds later, he heard the door of her room shut, then the telltale sound of the bolt lock sliding home. He had visions of little Angela flipping over the bed and hunkering behind it like the last man at the Alamo. He was left alone in his kitchen with the disorienting feeling that everything had slid out of control. What if this ex-husband had actually arrived? What was he prepared to do these days? How could he stand aside? Then he heard the voice over the bullhorn. His shoulders relaxed, his lips twisted. No big, bad, evil Jim. It was just his sister, summoned by Freddie and riding to the rescue. He squared his shoulders and prepared for the real war. Whoever had written that blood was thicker than water had never met the Dillons. Marion Margaret McAllister had committed only 2 sins in her life. 1, she'd been born the second child. 2, she'd been born a female. She'd done her best to rectify these sins over time. In the men's locker room world of the FBI, she could outshoot, outfight, and outthink her fellow agents. With her cool blonde looks, she'd earned the nickname Iceman. She liked it. Until 2 weeks ago, when her world had started falling apart. She'd just turned 34 and had been passed over for promotion again, ostensibly because she was too young. William Walker, who did get the post, was only 36, and Balling, the deputy director's daughter. Her father was dying of prostate cancer, a death that was taking a long time coming, and her husband of 10 years had left her for a 22-year-old cocktail waitress. Then last night she'd gotten the call from Freddie. JT always had impeccable timing. She motioned for the Nogales police to stay back and approach the house on her own. She wore her favorite navy blue pantsuit. It was sharp and 100% business. It was also too hot for Arizona. She focused on the cool feel of her gun pressed against her ribs while the dusty air stung her eyes. "Good morning, Marion," JT drawled. He lounged against the door jamb, half naked and rumpled, as if caught mid-fuck. "How kind of you to visit." "We received a report of an intruder. I came to investigate." "All the way from D.C.? "Nothing's too good for my older brother." She smiled with brittle sweetness and had the rare satisfaction of seeing her barb strike home. "Step out of the way, JT. The officers here will secure your house." "I don't think so." "Jordan Terrence, Freddie call you from town?" He shifted, crossing his ankles and getting more comfortable. She knew from Freddie that he drank a lot. She'd expected the alcohol to have taken a greater toll, but JT had always been a lucky SOB. Not even booze had thickened his waistline or sagged his middle. He was still the lean, fit man she remembered, the kid who'd won all the swimming trophies, the son whose uncanny shooting had made their father so proud. She wanted to strangle him. Freddie filed the report. She replied stiffly. "Ah, and here I thought he and I had reached an understanding." "What do you mean?" JT made a great show of examining his fingernails. "I know he calls you, Marion. I know he's Daddy's little spy. You're both so afraid that someday I'll get drunk enough to speak the truth. Don't worry. I've been speaking it for quite some time now, and nobody's interested." "I don't know what you're—" I sent him away. Told Freddie to take a few days off. I didn't think my visitor wanted an audience. As for myself, well, he shrugged. Freddie makes a fine margarita. Of course, now I'll have to reconsider his return. Calling the police about an intruder, that was pretty clever. I think he's a lot more clever than either of us suspect. So there is an intruder. Step aside. No. God damn it, JT, I know there's a woman inside. And what do you really know about her? Look at your track record. Leave my past out of it. We're going to search the house, JT. I want this woman gone. Got a search warrant? Of course not. We're responding to a report of an intruder. And I'm telling you, as owner of this property, there is no intruder. Now take your little blue men and find another party to crash. You stubborn, drunken son of a... Marion, you never did learn how to play nice. JT, as your sister, you're ashamed of me. Embarrassed to have me in the family, and on really good days you wish I was dead. I know, Marion. These open exchanges of family sentiment always leave me feeling warm and fuzzy all over. So help me God, JT, if I find so much as a BB gun on your property, it's Arizona, lax gun laws, you gotta love that in a state. I'm here to try to help you, JT. No, Marion, you're not. You're still doing Daddy's bidding, and we both know it. His voice grew suddenly soft. Why don't you ever stop by just to visit, Mary Berry? Why with you is it always war? Marion grew suffocated beneath the neck-high buttons of her suit, and for a moment she was beyond anger. JT straightened away from the door jamb. Send the cops away. Daddy never approved of outsiders nosing around in family business. Is he dead yet? No. Too bad. Well, it was nice talking to you. We should really get together more often. I'm not leaving. I'm sorry, Marion. You know I care about you, but I have this strong allergic reaction to federal agents. No, I'm afraid I have a strict no cops, no FBI agents policy for my property. You are such a bastard. I used to pray that was the case, but I probably have too much of the colonel in me for it to be true. What a shame. JT's implacable grin told her he wasn't budging. He always had been a stubborn ass, but then she could be stubborn too, and she had her orders, straight from the colonel. Fine. I'll check my badge at the door. And your backup band? JT nodded toward the cops. If you can assure us that there's no intruder inside, I'll send them on their way. Oh, the intruder's inside, all right. I think the boys in blue should go on their way anyhow. He smiled at her, then he walked inside and shut the door. She was left standing in the broiling sun with 3 state troopers looking at her for guidance. She wanted to scream, and she wanted to curse, but most of all, she wanted to forget she'd ever met her husband. Go home, she said to the troopers. I have the situation under control. Then she knocked on the door of her brother's house and prepared for round 2. Tess sat on the floor of her room, her ear pressed against the door. She'd locked it, but knew from experience that the lock was too feeble to hold. She still didn't have her gun, and wasn't sure what she'd do if she did. It was imperative that no one know she was there, but was she desperate enough to shoot an FBI agent to keep her identity secret? When she found herself thinking that she could just wound the woman, she realized she was desperate enough. She'd listened to the exchange in the front yard. Now she heard the woman's voice echo down the hall from the living room. All right, JT, where is she? She stepped out for a moment. I got the impression she didn't much care for the police. Oh, doesn't that tell you something right there, brother dear? Only that she's spent some time in L.A. Give it up, JT. If Lizzie Borden were alive today, she'd come to you for help. Tess wanted to resent that comment, but couldn't. Too many newspapers had referred to her as the Bride of Frankenstein. The tabloids had even carried her supposed biography under the headline, So I Married an Axe Murderer. The late-night talk show hosts had gotten in a few stingers as well. She didn't like to think about Jim. She wanted definitive answers and the clarity of hindsight. She didn't have that. Even after all these years, the images were murky and disjointed in her mind. The press could package her story as neatly as they wanted. She'd lived it, and the truth did not allow her that luxury. Jim Beckett had been handsome. He'd been strong. He was a highly commended police officer and a lonely man who'd been orphaned as a child. His mother had been frail, sickly, he told her. She'd collapsed when he was 8, and his father had died in an automobile accident rushing to her side. With no surviving relatives, he'd been placed with foster parents. He'd grown close to that family, but tragedy had struck again. When he was 14, His foster father had been killed in a hunting accident. His foster mother had fought to keep him, only to succumb to breast cancer while he was in college. Jim Beckett was alone in the world, but then he'd seen her. On their fourth date, he sat with her on the porch swing at her father's house and took her hand. "Teresa," he whispered somberly, "I know about your father, how he treats you and your mother. I understand how afraid you must be. But you're not alone anymore. I love you, baby. We're alike. We each have no one. But now we'll be together forever. No one is ever going to hurt you again." She believed him. She cried that night while he rocked her against his chest, and she thought, "Finally, my white knight has arrived." 6 months later, she became Jim's bride in one of the largest weddings Williamstown had ever seen. She moved from her father's house and watched Jim hang a blown-up wedding portrait above the mantel of their new home. It was the first thing anyone saw when they walked into the Beckett house, a huge, glossy photo of the most beautiful blonde couple in Williamstown. People nicknamed them Ken and Barbie. On their honeymoon, Jim sat her down and explained that there were a few rules she would need to follow. She was a wife now, a police officer's wife. The rules were straightforward. Always walk 2 steps behind him. Always ask his permission before buying anything. Wear only clothes he'd approved. Always keep the house immaculate, and always cook his steak rare. Never question him or his schedule. She nodded. She was confused, but she promised to try. She was an 18-year-old bride. She wanted to be perfect. She made mistakes. The second night after they returned from their honeymoon, Jim burned her wedding dress to punish her for buying note cards without asking. She begged him not to, so he burned her veil as well. She wasn't supposed to question him. She must remember not to question him. She struggled to remember that. She struggled to adapt. In the first few weeks, she lost most of her personal belongings to the fire: her cheerleading outfit, her baby blanket, her yearbook. For a change of pace, Jim cut up her childhood teddy bear into little pieces, then burned the pieces when she didn't have dinner on the table in time. Jim told her she must be stupid to lose so much stuff, so she tried harder. She didn't want to fail the only person who claimed to love her, and he didn't hit her. He yelled sometimes, he was strict, he told her she was stupid, but he never, ever raised his hand. She was so grateful for that. She learned. She ran out of stuff for him to destroy. Then she discovered she was pregnant, and life settled down. Jim couldn't wait to be a father. When she gave birth to Sam, he showed up at the hospital with the most ridiculously expensive strand of pearls. He told her she was beautiful, she'd done well, and she thought everything would be all right. 2 months later, Jim announced it was time to have a second child. She sat at the dinner table, breastfeeding Samantha and feeling so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open. She made a mistake. She forgot about the rule and said no. She couldn't handle 2 babies and maintain a spotless, perfect household. Jim grew quiet. He set down his fork. He pinned her with his overbright blue eyes. "You can't handle it, Teresa? Do you think of hurting Samantha? Is that what you're telling me? Do you think of beating my baby? I know it's in your blood." She cried. She said no. She'd never do such a thing. She could tell he didn't believe her. Later that week, she committed her first act of blatant rebellion. She bought a diaphragm and hid it under the bathroom sink. The week after that, she pulled it out and discovered a pin resting delicately on top. Jim stood behind her, his face implacable. She couldn't take it anymore. She hadn't slept in 2.5 months. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, and frightened she would fail as a mother. She began to sob. Jim finally moved. She cringed, but he just took her in his arms. He stroked her hair, touching her gently for the first time in months, and told her everything would be all right. He would help her. He lowered her to the bathroom floor. He pushed up her skirt. He took her while she lay there, too exhausted, too shocked, and too much in pain to move. Afterward, he told her he wanted a boy this time, a boy to name Brian, after his father. Jim's absences grew longer, and his returns crueler. Whatever she did, it wasn't good enough. She was a bad wife, a horrible mother. She was a stupid, stupid girl who should be grateful he'd agreed to marry her. A handsome, charming, well-respected man like him could certainly do better. One day he sat her down in the living room and told her he was going out. He would be gone for a while. Maybe he'd return, maybe not. He hadn't decided yet. No matter what, she was not to go down into the basement. The basement? Why would I go into the basement? Because I told you not to go there, so now you're thinking about it. And you'll think about it the minute I leave. What is in the basement? Why shouldn't I go into the basement? What is hiding in the basement? I planted the suggestion in your mind. You won't be able to rest until you go into the basement. I know you that well, Teresa. I can control you that much. No, I won't go into the basement. I won't. But the minute he left, her eyes fell on the basement door. She put her hand on the doorknob. She twisted. She opened the door and stared down into the gloom. Tess quickly cut off the rest of the memories. She pressed her fingers against her temples, already tasting bile. Some days she could recall things objectively. She could distance herself, analyze the scenes as if they'd happened in somebody else's life. Some days she couldn't. Now she concentrated on breathing and the feel of the warm Arizona sun. Down the hall, Marion and J.T. continued to war. "He's dying, J.T. It's not some twisted ruse." Marion's voice was brittle. "Our father is dying." "Our father? I don't think so. I gave him to you when you were 14. We were playing poker, as I recall, and I was beating you quite badly. You threw a fit, so I said, fine, what was the one thing you really wanted?" "Fuck you, Jordan Terrence. And you said you wanted Daddy all to yourself. So I gave him to you lock, stock, and barrel. To this day, I believe you got the bad end of that deal. Or tell me, Marion, did you forget that as well?" "I didn't forget anything, J.T. I just chose to remember happier days." There was a long pause, then Marion said, "It's because of her, isn't it?" A second pause. "She had a name, Marion. She was a human being. She was a lying, manipulative prostitute who caught Daddy in a weak moment. He just retired. He was vulnerable to female attention." Mom will be happy with this analysis. Mom has more bats in her belfry than a Gothic church. Finally, we agree on something. The point is, Daddy made a mistake. A mistake? He got a 17-year-old girl pregnant. Our father, the pedophile. He took care of her. Is that what you call it? JT's voice dropped to a low tone that prickled the hair on the back of Tess's neck. Marion didn't recover quickly this time, but when she did, her retort was sharp. "Oh, that's right. Daddy is the root of all evil. Hell, he was probably the one standing at the grassy knoll." "I wouldn't put it past him. Have you ever watched the JFK tapes closely?" "Grow up, JT. Daddy needs you right now, though God knows why. Maybe you don't like him, maybe you're never going to see eye to eye with him, but for Christ's sake, he gave you life. He put a roof over your head. He raised you and gave you anything you ever asked for. A sports car, West Point, military appointments, cover-up, you got it all. And it still burns, doesn't it, Marion?" JT said quietly, though Roger was hardly a shabby consolation prize. "Roger left me, JT, but thanks for asking." "What?" JT sounded genuinely surprised, perhaps even stunned. "Marion, I'm sorry. I swear to you, I'm sorry. I did not come here for your pity. You utter those words one more time and they'll need superglue to put your face together again. No, don't say anything more. I'm sick of this conversation. It never gets any better. I'm staying 7 days, JT. 7 days for you to see the light. Then I wash my hands of this whole mess." "Mary Berry, don't call me that, and tell your guest that if I catch either one of you doing anything remotely illegal, I'll arrest both your asses. Got it? You don't have to scream for me to know how much you care. Oh, go knit yourself a Hallmark card." Tess heard the sharp, ringing sound of heels against hardwood floors. The fast, furious footsteps grew closer, and Tess held her breath. But the sound passed her by. Marion stormed to the end bedroom, where her arrival was punctuated by the sound of the door slamming shut. Tess released her breath. Her body sagged against the door. Everything was okay. This Marion was an FBI agent, but she was also JT's sister, and was here for reasons that had nothing to do with Tess. She was safe. No one knew who she was, and she was still in Arizona. She couldn't take any more. It was still afternoon, but her exhausted body demanded rest. She crawled into bed, pulled the covers over her head, and welcomed slumber.